Well, welcome everyone. We're delighted that you could join us today. My name is Dave Jones, and I direct the Climate Risk Initiative at the Berkeley Law Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. And we're so excited in collaboration with the European Union and the Berkeley Law Center for Business to host this gathering this afternoon to explore in a robust and thorough way all the new developments that have been occurring in Europe, in the United States, both at the national level but also the state of California level with regard to new requirements as it relates to climate risk disclosure. Just a brief commercial about the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. We have a long mission statement. I won't read it all right now. But we are basically what I like to think of as an action tank. You've heard of think tanks, but we're an action tank. We draw on the resources of Berkeley Law and the rest of the university with our expert staff, but as well our relationships with faculty member and students and others throughout the UC Berkeley and the UC system to develop policy, to do research around policy, and to move that research into action to try to address the globe's greatest challenge, the climate crisis, as well as other environmental challenges. So we're very, very excited today to be able to co-host with the European Union and the Berkeley Law Center on Business this conference. Just a point of personal privilege. I actually lived in Brussels for a semester a long time ago. When I was a college senior, I did a semester abroad in a U.S. program attached to the, and this is my only French, Université de Libre de Bruxelles, at 50 Franklin Avenue in adjacent to the Bois de la Cambre. And I loved Brussels. It was fantastic. And that program was actually focused on the politics, history, and economics of the European Union. And then a couple years later, after I served as a counselor to Janet Reno when she was the United States Attorney General, I had a chance to participate in the European Union Visitors Program and go back to Brussels and spend a little bit of time in the Netherlands looking at the EU and also the Dutch policy with regard to drug offenses. So I have a special soft spot in my heart for the European Union and for the Commissioner. So our run of the show is this. We're going to have the opportunity to hear from Commissioner McGuinness in a moment. Then we'll have an opportunity to hear from Ann Simpson, who is a terrific, terrific leader in this space as well, and I'll have a chance to introduce her a little bit more when it's her turn to speak. And then we're going to have two panels that will follow on where we do a deeper dive into the subject matter of today's conference. We'll have a little break somewhere in the midst there, and then there's a reception from 5 to 7, courtesy of the European Union. I'm not sure whether we went with Stella Artois, Guinness, or maybe Bud. I'm not sure. Who knows? But I want to thank the European Union for graciously hosting the reception afterwards, and there'll be a chance to meet one another and talk a little bit informally. I also want to thank Maya Batesley, who's back there in the corner from CLEE, for all the tremendous work she's done to set this up, and Kayla Lamb, who's done all the communications work associated and other work associated with this. If you have any questions, do ask them. This law school is a bit of a maze. And so the restrooms, if you go out the door here, take a right, before you hit the wall, take a left, and when you come to the end of that point, take another right, and go down the corridor next to the big mural. There'll be a test on that after the conference. So with that, it's my great treat to introduce Commissioner McGuinness, the European Commissioner for Financial Services, Financial Stability, and the Capital Markets Union. Commissioner McGuinness's vision for the portfolio is focused on ensuring the financial sector's strength and its stability so that it can deliver for people, society, and the environment. Before joining the Commission in October 2020, Commissioner McGuinness was first Vice President of the European Parliament. She served as a member of the European Parliament from Ireland for 16 years and was a Vice President of the Parliament since 2014. And before that, she had a distinguished career as a very, very successful journalist. Please join me in welcoming Commissioner Mairead McGuinness.
Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome. I'm delighted to be back in college. And I think if anything, our colleges have to be places where we think outside the box. And it's really an honor to be talking about a subject which I know is very close to your heart, Dave, and colleagues here. The last time I was in San Francisco was 1979. Some were not born at that stage, but trust me, the world existed. So it's nice to be back. I've been to the States, obviously, a number of times, but this is my return visit. And the streets are quieter, and I've learned all about people staying home and working from home. So it's important, I think, for us to travel so that we can physically meet and engage with each other. I think California is very well known for your work on climate change. And I think, to quote you, this action tank, I like that because we do a lot of thinking and talking, but the action is the missing link. And I will elaborate on that point. We cooperate closely, including on carbon markets. And I think we've inspired each other, which is necessary in a topic which raises alarm and fear and anxiety, particularly when we're not acting. And as we know, we're getting closer to the brink. So it's very important that we listen to each other. I know there is the California effect and there's the Brussels effect, which are usually good effects, not always welcomed by everybody, but I think we should leverage the fact that we do have an effect. We are leaders in certain areas. Sometimes I think if we're too far ahead, we will lose the rest. So I think we need to lead while all the time looking around so that we bring people with us, including inside in Europe, and I will elaborate on that. If I look to what we've done with the Brussels effect, data privacy, consumer protection, health and safety, food safety, environmental protection, where we have started, it has generally others have adopted. And I don't say that as being proud or, saying, gosh, we're great. It's saying, isn't it good that we have been able to provide that leadership? And we've done that by the institutions working together. So my old institution, the European Parliament, the Commission where I sit now, and the member states. It's complicated, colleagues, that's all I'll say. But then your politics is complicated too. Ours is working. Let's see how things evolve. Okay, so my topic today is sustainable finance. And one of the questions I asked myself when I took on this role is, why do we have to call it sustainable finance? And of course, it's finance with a purpose. And that means we have had to put in place all sorts of laws in order that the effect of sustainable finance would be real. And again, the EU and California have a lot in common here because we've both been very active. I want to focus on what Europe has done and where we're heading, and to say that this is not a new topic. It's been around for about 2 decades. In the 1990s, the world had agreed the Kyoto Protocol with targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The Millennium Development Goals in 2000 put sustainability at the top of the policy-making agenda. In the early 2000s, governments and public bodies were just starting to think about novel ways to finance climate action. And the scale of the challenge was becoming very clear, leading to the question, how are we going to change and how will we pay for that change? And some of the early front runners with the answers to those questions were here in California. In 2001, San Francisco decided to build a solar panel network, and voters here endorsed the use of bonds to finance that project. Investors and the private sector, too, were starting to become much more interested in ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. So ESG entered the mainstream with the 2006 UN Principles for Responsible Investment report, which suggested incorporating ESG criteria alongside finance when investors looked at a company's performance. So maybe rather than the blinkers on and looking at one component only, this was taking a 360 view of companies and their delivery and performance. The EU's lending arm, the European Investment Bank, issued the first green bond in 2007. The EIB wanted a tool to fund green projects, and they knew that there were investors who wanted to invest in something they could be sure was green. And that's a big topic. How are you sure that your money's going in that direction? So there were people thinking about how financial instruments could be put to work for climate action already a couple of decades ago. The next important step was a 2015 Paris Agreement. It's well known, of course, for its aim to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it also recognized the central role of money. And it called for, and I quote, making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So the European Commission in 2016, we tasked a group of experts with finding ways to respond to this small task. So we had financial industry, we had NGOs, we had academia and business trying to develop policy recommendations that could enable public and private capital to flow towards sustainable investments. And they also looked at how to minimize risks to the EU financial system from climate change. And I think that was very significant, that climate was actually, it mattered to the financial system's very stability. And as financial stability is one of the titles in my very long title, it matters to me that this is still a threat and a risk to financial stability. There was also a continued demand from investors who wanted to invest in sustainable projects, but of course they needed help to know what a sustainable project looked like. They needed more transparency, and they needed tools for sustainable investing. In 2018, the EU's first action plan on sustainable finance created a sustainable finance framework. And here the idea was to enable investors to know more about sustainable investments, supporting transparency by both companies and investors, and developing practical tools for the financial system. And then the following year, we launched our European Green Deal. And I hope you've heard of the European Green Deal. This was the EU's plan to reach net zero by 2050 and to become the first climate neutral continent. It set out some of the investments we would need to chart our course to a more sustainable planet, and that private money would be vital alongside public money. And I think that's really important today, that we know the public purse is simply not enough, and we need to harness private capital towards our more sustainable targets. So this framework, Sustainable Finance Framework, offered the tools to allow the private sector finance the transition. And I think one of the topics that really is close to my heart is if we talk about green and brown, we miss the middle, which is those that want to transition. So I think we need to talk more and more about transition and transition finance. There are three complementary building blocks that make up the EU Sustainable Finance Framework. First is the EU taxonomy. Essentially, this is a reference handbook clarifying what economic activities are in line with our climate and environmental targets. There are criteria for activities that make a substantial contribution to climate mitigation and climate adaptation in sectors from insurance to energy, from manufacturing to transport. Since last year, we have criteria for 4 environmental objectives: the sustainable use of water, the circular economy, preventing pollution, and protecting biodiversity. So it means the EU taxonomy is getting broader, and that means it is getting more usable across more sectors, which means the taxonomy has more potential to scale up sustainable investments in the EU. It's not easy, I want to say, the taxonomy. That's not in the speech, but truthfully, we need to have a conversation about the reality of a taxonomy and the development work that goes into it and getting political acceptance of it. Please ask me about all of those. Now, the second element I want to mention is a comprehensive disclosure regime for investors and companies, and this is about ensuring transparency. And here we have the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, SFDR. So this is really important. It sets out how market participants have to disclose sustainability information about their investment products. And this helps investors who want to make sustainable investments. And then for companies, we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And here companies will report on their sustainability, both their impact on people and the environment, as well as the impact of climate risks on their businesses. This we call the double materiality perspective. And it's a particularly European thing, I think, but I'm interested to know what your thoughts are here. We've already adopted a first set of European sustainability reporting standards. And these standards set out the details of what companies have to report. The standards are mandatory for large and listed companies in the European Union. And I've really been battling with my communication with the companies because I don't want this and didn't want it to be seen as just another compliance issue. Have to do it rather than something that was actually a management tool and something that if you took on with would guarantee your future because you have to deal with these topics. So I really wanted companies to see these standards as a way of giving them clear guidelines for assessing their performance on sustainability and to see where they can improve. I think we're very aware of the global context of all of this work and the need for coherence, because this has often been said to Europe, what are you doing around global coherence? If you're doing your own thing on standards, are you looking and listening to the rest of the world? And my big and strong message is, when it comes to ISSB, Global Reporting Initiative, etc., our goal at the European level is that companies that report on our standards, the European standards, automatically then meet the ISSB standards. Now, I do say we go further than ISSB because we reflect the double materiality that I've mentioned, and this is different, but it is important. We are very much committed to comparability in corporate sustainability reporting at the global scale. And I know that you here are doing a lot of work on corporate disclosures. So really looking forward to hearing more on that. And the reason I'm very keen that we have a global perspective, because climate change will not be addressed by Europe alone. It is a global challenge. So we need to make sure our frameworks sit comfortably with each other. The third part of our framework here is a set of tools and labels to enable the financial sector make an impact. So things like climate benchmarks, the EU Green Bond Standard. And if you look at what the European Investment Bank did in 2007, issuing the first green bonds, I think there is therefore a strong European tradition of green bonds. But the question for investors is, do they have enough information about what they're investing in? And I think that's why we address this topic with the European Green Bond Standard. It's now available for issuers from the private and public sectors, from the EU and across the world. It is voluntary. Issuers can use this or they are not. And if they want to demonstrate their alignment with the taxonomy, then they will, of course, use these standards. Investors can be sure then about the environmental credentials of their investments. The standard could be especially useful for companies that are in transition towards greater sustainability, including those in challenging sectors like steel, cement, and aluminium. So we built this comprehensive framework in Europe. And yet, as I said, we all know climate is a global challenge. Global leadership and cooperation are really important, and more important than ever, particularly at a time when there are so much geopolitical issues and fragmentation. And I think the good news is that many countries and regions around the world are working on sustainable finance. In Europe, we've worked hard to make sure that our work links into the global context. And one of the things I'd like to mention here is the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, which the Commission helped establish. So here is a platform where you can exchange information and see where we can align our work. And it brings together policymakers from 20 jurisdictions, so it's quite a broad reach. And together, we represent in that platform more than half the world's GDP, population, and emissions. And the platform recognizes that everyone has their own pathways, political priorities, local characteristics, and transition considerations. And one area of work is, of course, transition finance, how we finance the decarbonization of high-emission sectors. In 2022, the platform published a set of voluntary transition finance principles, looking at how policymakers can incentivize this transition. We also, in the European Union, work very actively in the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. And again, key topics here: transition finance principles, how to accelerate transition finance, and benefits and challenges from sustainability reporting. But there is, as they say, a backlash. We have done a huge amount of work on sustainable finance, but the truth is that this climate transition is not all plain sailing. And we are now at a point where the effects of our framework are starting to be felt. Every new initiative brings challenges, and we are working with companies as they begin to make disclosures under these new rules. I know that in some parts of the US, there is a backlash against the very concept of ESG investment, though here in California, you have a long history of supporting ESG. Elsewhere, some even question the reality of climate change. Now, that isn't a debate we're having in Europe. I think it's well accepted. We've had visible evidence, wildfires, powerful storms, droughts and floods. You know, they've hit many European countries over the past few years. But there is some discontent about whether we're going about tackling climate action in the right way and whether the burden is fairly distributed. And we use a term, just transition. And it's a really nice term, and it should mean a lot, and it does. But are we really able to deliver a just transition? And we need to talk more broadly about money and where it goes to allow for this just transition. I'll give you an example, and there will be more of it tomorrow. I know you have your protests here, but we have had farmers taking to the streets across Europe. And tomorrow they'll be in Brussels again. And it's been interesting. It wasn't an overnight decision for farmers to protest. And it's not just about rules and regulations. It's about many things. And frankly, in the member state I know best, one of their biggest drivers of frustration and worry is very unusual weather patterns driven by climate. So farmers feel immediately the impacts of climate change, but they are a little bit anxious about the various actions we have suggested are necessary to deal with climate. And therefore, I'm interested to share your experience. How do we communicate our policy? Are we listening enough or talking too much? Are we telling people what they should do because we know better? Or are we saying, actually, you feel the effects straight away? What do you think you can do, and what can we do collectively? And I think we've learned lessons from perhaps not being perfect in our communication. And I think listening is really key, because we will not force people to change. I think you have to give people ownership of change, that there is a societal acceptance, and there's a whole of society support for the change. If I look at financial services, we find that CEOs do not question the need for more sustainable action and tackling climate. But I have to say they are less enthusiastic about some of the measures that we've brought in to deliver on our climate and environmental targets and commitments. And on this point, I say every time I'm challenged on this, I said, frankly, I would rather I didn't have to propose all of these, if you like, pieces of a complicated jigsaw. I would rather this information was freely available and that it was clear, comparable, and that you could depend on it. But you couldn't, and it wasn't, and it didn't. So it required us to do what we've just done. And I think people get that, but don't underestimate the complexity of the reactions. If I look at EU banks, they're also looking at their portfolios, and they are required to make sure that they're moving towards more sustainability. And here too, we've had to listen and be proportionate to help the financial sector make this transition, to better explain our rules, and to change or clarify them where that was necessary. For the transition to net zero to be fully successful, I think we absolutely know that everyone has to be on board. And it also means not just focusing on what's already green or already sustainable, but helping those just starting out on their transition. And I have to say that maybe we were too binary in the beginning of this conversation. I mean, brown, green, good, bad, but actually most of us want to be good most of the time, and those who are in that transition process actually want to get there. And we have to listen to why they find it difficult, or indeed what we could do better, maybe do less rather than more. So to that point, we developed a recommendation on how our sustainable finance tools can finance the transition for companies at all stages of their journey. And this is back to my point, that rather than this being seen as a compliance burden and a cost, that actually it's a management tool, and a very effective one, because instead of having to choose various different ways to report and therefore have very confused reports from companies, this gives clarity, and that should be welcome. So this would also depend on whether you're at the start of a journey or indeed you're further advanced. if I mention again the EU taxonomy, isn't there just to describe what's already sustainable? Because companies can also voluntarily use our taxonomy criteria to set targets for where they want their business or activities to go as part of their transition plans. And you do not have to be already sustainable. So rather than pointing fingers at industries that are not sustainable, because that doesn't help either, it's to say, look, all of these tools are to help you start on the journey, and we'll actually help you by providing guidance or whatever you need to use all our sustainable finance framework. And we have been listening because we want our framework to be usable, and we want it to be practical for companies and investors. And we've learned that we can make improvements. We set out some targeted initiatives to improve the usability of the rules and support stakeholders in implementation. And supporting implementation will continue to be a very key priority of the Commission. We've also looked at the reporting burden for companies. We know that this is a first time for many companies to report on sustainability. It's easier to record profit and loss. You can add some it's quite a, it's a core thing. It's not new, it's forever there. And profitability also matters. We might have that discussion as well. What we've done when it comes to new sector-specific European sustainability reporting standards is we've pushed back the introduction a little to allow companies get used to a step-by-step approach. And we want our companies to be able to focus on the first standards that are out there. These are the horizontal ones. We're responding to challenges, and despite them, the first signals from the market are encouraging. So even though I know there's a bit of pushback, the signals are positive. Our advisory body, the Platform on Sustainable Finance, it published a report recently showing our framework is being used more and more. And companies are using the taxonomy to set targets and back up claims on sustainability. And this is helping them to access finance. Auditors can see the shift in companies' mindsets. They're moving from general goals to very specific targets. Investors and lenders are able to compare companies' transition efforts. So, what I've just described in terms of pushback or concerns are teething problems, I think, with something that is new. Overall, the EU Sustainable Finance Framework is starting to help the private sector join the climate transition. And that work will continue long after I'm gone and immediately after I go, because it has to. Because there is a pathway here. We want to support economic growth, and we want our businesses to thrive and innovate. But this doesn't contradict our work on sustainable finance. And in Europe, there's more talk about competitiveness. But that is not to the detriment of sustainability. And they are not incompatible objectives. They are very compatible. Maybe the timing is the issue that could be out of sync, because a sustainable business has to be competitive. So in the medium to long term, we all need entities, large and small, to pay attention to sustainability, or you face dying out, becoming a fossil. Which is why I'm interested to be here in California to hear your perspectives. Because I think in my time since late 2020 in the Commission, we suffered COVID. We have the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We have the horrors of Hamas in Israel, and now what's happening from a humanitarian point of view in Gaza. And now we have the Iranian crisis. So, this is a difficult time in the world, and meanwhile, we're burning. One of our colleagues in the ECB has a very speech just today, Frank Elderson, and his point is that we're not, which is true, going to hit our targets. And his point, which I will reiterate here as I close, is that, climate issues are not just nice to have to address, they're vital because of financial stability. So even if you're not a hardcore environmentalist, so you care deeply about society and the world, if you care about finance and financial stability, tackling these things matter, because our banking system will not be stable if we do not address these topics. So I hope I've given you food for thought. Behind all those words, there's been a lot of energy and to-ing and fro-ing between Parliament, Council, and internally in the Commission. But I think we've achieved what I wanted to achieve, which are pieces of a jigsaw. Some of them are not quite fitting together, and we need to fine-tune those. But most of them show that the big picture is there for those who want to use all our tools to be much more sustainable for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Commissioner McGuinness, for those inspiring remarks and for laying out the extraordinary history of Europe and its member states' leadership as it relates to sustainability, the tremendously important evolution with regard to transparency, but also action, but some of the challenges as well that have been experienced along the way and which are still being experienced. And we're very excited to get to do a deeper dive on those in our follow-on panel. But you have certainly laid down a marker for all of us here in the United States with regard to the importance of making sure that we are putting in place a framework, a set of criteria, a set of tools, and a set of mechanisms to help the finance sector as well as the real economy achieve sustainability, because it's in all our interests. We won't have a real economy or financial sector if the globe burns. So thank you very, very much. Next, we're going to have an opportunity to hear from another leader in the area of sustainability and finance, and that's my friend Ann Simpson, who is currently the Global Head of Sustainability at Franklin Templeton Companies, former Managing Investment Director at the California Public Employees Retirement System. Ann reports to the President and CEO at Franklin Templeton, and in this role, she's responsible for driving the company's strategic direction on stewardship, sustainability, and ESG investment strategy globally, while fostering best practices within the firm's autonomous specialist investment managers. When she was at CalPERS, she led that incredibly important organizations and one of the largest asset owners in the world, their efforts with regard to embrace sustainability, and also in that role helped CalPERS garner a number of significant accomplishments as well as Sustainable Investment Strategy Awards reflecting her leadership and that of CalPERS. She's got an extraordinary bio. I encourage you to take a look at it. She's also teaching at Haas, which is just up the hill. And so we're very, very delighted to have with us Ann Simpson, who's going to, I believe, share some remarks on the development here of the new SEC rule, and in specific, some of what happened along that journey, but also paint a broader picture, I believe, about why all of this is so important. So thank you very, very much, Ann. Welcome. Please join me in welcoming Ann Simpson.
Well, good afternoon. What a treat to be here. What an honor to be following the Commissioner. And the best thing about this afternoon's event so far is the title. I love this, From Brussels to the Bay. Now, who loves or hates Brussels sprouts? Come on, come on. Hate? Love? Bit of both? Oh. Well, anyway, I was thinking the important thing about Brussels, the message that would come from Brussels if I were my mother, is eat your greens. We don't care whether you like them or not. I remember my mother serving Brussels. It was a Sunday lunch ritual. It was a good Catholic family, back from Mass, and the pub closed, and then Sunday lunch, and the Brussels sprouts are coming out. And my mother, who was always brought up to be polite, would say, well, darling, and would you like some Brussels sprouts? And I'd say, no, thank you, Mummy. She said, well, you're getting them anyway, because they're good for you. So this really could be the mantra for the whole of this conversation that we're having. Actually, it's good for you. You're going to have to eat your greens. So what I thought I could do is just spend a few minutes with you talking from an investor perspective. As Dave kindly said, I think you and I first met when I was at CalPERS. Now at Franklin Templeton, I used to work at the World Bank. I've done all sorts of other jobs in the world of finance. But something that we forget when we're talking about finance is who the money belongs to. So think about this. All right, another question for the people. How much money is in the world? How much money do you think we've all got between us? Give it a shot. Come on, some brave soul, put your hand out. You all had a view on Brussels sprouts. Come on, you got a view on money. You've all got a bit in your pocket, or you wish you did. How much do you think there is? The young man with the beard, I'd like a number from you. Yes, the one that's not looking at me very studiously, because he's hoping I don't ask him this question. Just give me, lovely, yeah, a lot, great start, a number. $1 billion, it's good. Any more? Anyone more than $1 billion? No, that's okay. Did you say a squillion? A gajillion? No. Come on, somebody said $1 billion. Is there more than $1 billion in the world? Yes. How many more? How much more? Hundreds of billions. Okay, now we're getting somewhere, people. How about, yes, Kirsten. Right, Kirsten's got that Las Vegas thing going on. Yeah, come on, the big money, the big spender, trillions. So give or take a few billion, there's about $500 trillion in the world, money-wise. Money. Forget assets and stuff you can value. Just money sloshing around. The next important thing is, does it all belong to Elon Musk? Does it all belong to billionaires? People who like to go up in space rockets and have their name in the papers. Who does this money belong to? Any thoughts? Yes, the public. You said it in one. Think about pension funds like CalPERS. CalPERS is the biggest in the US, as Dave said. There's 2 million people in CalPERS. Judges, janitors, primary school teachers, environmental scientists, those people who annoy you at the DMV because they take so long to process your driving license and your dog license, all that. Everyone in public service is relying on CalPERS to pay a pension. And when I was at CalPERS, we used to produce this little dollar bill, a bit like Monopoly money. We call it your CalPERS pension buck. I said, oh, thanks. No, it's not your real pension. Don't be that happy about it. It's just to illustrate where does this dollar come from. And what we could show with this pretend dollar bill is for every dollar we pay out, 60 cents comes from investment returns. 60 cents. So what does this tell us? Like, first of all, the money in the financial system belongs to ordinary working people. Pension savers, the other big category, taxpayers putting money in through sovereign wealth funds. Then think about insurance, think about mortgages, think about bank deposits. You're not getting away from the fact that this is the people's money. And if we, first of all, need to think about finance differently, this is not something that people play around with on Wall Street. This is not, you know, rich people's hobby and fun. The financial markets are generating retirement income. They're paying for healthcare. They're paying for housing. They're paying for education. So guess what? As the Commissioner said, let's stop for a minute and think, what is the purpose of finance? We tend to stop at the door of the company and say, oh, the money is invested in the corporation and the corporation will make profit, and that becomes the purpose. We're confusing an end, like what's the ultimate goal, with the means, which is how do we get there? Now, you're not going to attract investment into anything unless you produce a return on capital. And one measure of that is profit. There are others, but that will do for now. So the point is, once we know that ordinary working people provide the money for the system, furthermore, they need the system to work financially just to pay pensions. Now we can stop talking about shareholders versus stakeholders. We can stop talking about shareholders as though it's something that goes on in Wall Street or the City of London or in Tokyo. Think about the financial system as the place where everyone is saving, and we need the system to work to produce the returns. So that's one thing. Now, this poses a question. Why the heck doesn't that idea show up in the phrase or the acronym ESG? ESG. There's no reference to people. Well, maybe S is a bit, There's no reference to money. And I'll tell you a story. I was speaking at the PRI some years ago. I was the warm-up act for Al Gore. And Al Gore's off on the side of the stage, and I've been asked to come and speak for 9 minutes. You know, something like that. Warm people up, keep them entertained while the really wonderful person is getting ready. Anyway, as I came, I was like, hello? Yes, you can all hear me. Marvellous. I looked over, and he was already there. He'd arrived. I wasn't needed, and I could see this woman going like this. It's like, okay, 9 seconds? Yeah, 9 seconds. Perfect, 9 seconds. So what I wanted to talk about was what I've just said this afternoon, is think about money, think about for whom we invest, what accountability we should have to them. Once you acknowledge that, you'll start thinking about so-called ESG very, very differently, or the just transition, as the Commissioner mentioned. Who here has read the Paris Agreement? 1, 2, 3, 4.5. Some read it and can't remember what it said, but that's okay. The most important part of the Paris Agreement is the first page and a half, in which the just transition is set out as the purpose of this agreement. It's about taking care of the workers, vulnerable communities, migrant communities, the disabled, the special needs of indigenous people, women. So it goes on. This is all that purpose is set out at the beginning. Anyway, this is what I said in my speech. 9 seconds, and I said, well, today I'd like to talk to you about the importance of how we think about finance, as this is about investment. Sounds boring. People are like, oh, where's Al Gore? I said, so in short, I leave you with this question. Where's the F in ESG? There was this silence, and then people started to titter and laugh because they thought I was swearing. Where's the F in ESG? I mean, where is the F for finance in ESG? So that's the first thing I want to say. Now, if we think about generating returns for a pension fund, let's just stick with that example. And let's stick with CalPERS, because it's so very big and it's local. It's our local friendly neighborhood pension fund. The other thing to think about is the time horizon. So at CalPERS, we'd have to push out $25 billion a year, back to your billions, 25 of those every year to current pensioners in CalPERS. So we've got to produce a lot of cash, and it's got to be safe, and it's got to be reliable. So that's one type of investment. All this talk about returns and making money, hey. Keep what you've got, keep it safe, deliver it on time. That's cash. So that's one piece of the job. The next piece of the job is, we've got these young trainee firefighters joining aged 18, straight from school. When are they going to retire? How many years hence? What will their dependents will have an entitlement? And by the time you start looking at that, like who's actually in your pension scheme, you realize even if you shut the door tomorrow at CalPERS, you have to keep producing returns for the best part of a century. Think about that. So if now we've got to be able to walk and chew gum, we've got to be able to produce cash, safe and sound for people in retirement, and we've then got to grow the assets in the fund for close to 100 years, then the question is, how much have you got to grow the fund by? Any ideas? Well, the current discount rate, as it's called, is an approximation for how much money are you trying to make. CalPERS is about 6.8%, eye-wateringly high, on almost $500 billion. So we're not fooling around here. If we're saying, here's your pension buck, we're going to have to promise 60 cents on every dollar now and for the next century. And we've remembered, it's your money. We've remembered this is not money that belongs to Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Jamie Dimon. This is ordinary working people's money. And we need a model in which that gets put into our framing. So what we did at CalPERS and what we're using at Franklin Templeton is a different model. And in fact, I have to say, the phrase before the backlash even began was RIP to ESG. Rest in peace. That means thank you. But good night. Right? You got us thinking about these things. Now, that model isn't going to function because the first thing it's done is leave us incredibly vulnerable to people who say, well, what the? Capitalism. What are you doing running investment without any reference to finance? You're talking about E and S and G, and then we're running over here saying, hang on a minute, all that ESG. Oh, yeah, it's all going to show up in risk-adjusted returns. How do you know that? Well, we've got all these, go back again. Studies, data, and now, and hey, hang on, why don't we just begin at the beginning and say financial returns are part of sustainable investment because the money belongs to the people and there's a social purpose to finance. We take care of that, that's going to be at the heart of our model. Okay, good, we can't argue about that anymore. Second part, rather than talk about S for society, which is everything, isn't it? We talk about human capital. That puts people into our model, but to the extent that we understand the workforce, the supply chain, the community, there are measurable and understandable activities that impact a company's business around people. It's called human capital. And then this thing about E for the environment. Do I mean the butterflies in my garden? I mean, what is it, you know, David Attenborough programs? I mean, the environment is such a huge topic. No, let's think about natural capital. So for a company, it needs three things. It needs money, it needs people, and it needs stuff. And by stuff, I mean, you're going to need an atmosphere. You're going to need water. You're going to need electricity. Oh, we might then need some specific stuff because we're in cement, or we're in steel, or we're in agriculture. You get a bit more particular. That's the beauty of sector-based reporting, that what matters to Unilever will look rather different to what matters to Tesla in terms of natural capital. But they both need money, that's financial capital, and they both rely on people. So this model that we've built of financial, human, and natural capital is an economic basis for talking about what does sustainability mean. And I would say what we've had in the United States is battle royal. Well, in the Republic, we shouldn't say that, should we? Battle Republic, not battle royal in America. Battle of the Republic over this idea that capitalism is under threat because people are starting to follow what the SEC is calling for on risk reporting in parallel to what the European Union, I said earlier, the EU is the center of gravity on all of this. Incredibly important, everything that you're doing. And then we've got the wider community of the IFRS with EU within it. We have the United States, and within that we have California. So to me, in a way, California is the EU of the global markets. California plays that role, I think, in the United States of being the center of gravity on innovation and on this and no less. Okay, so what I want to then move on to, and really this is my final point, is if we can take back our overall understanding of finance, we're in a much stronger position whenever we're talking about climate risk. We could be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We could be talking about human rights in the supply chain. We could be talking about water risk or biodiversity. All of these topics will then, you will, with that model, be able to shape them into a financial risk and return model. And we need to do that. We need to just say thank you and good night to ESG as the language. So I want to finish with what is the SEC proposing, and what are the naysayers complaining about when they're told to eat their greens, right? What's their excuse? Because the SEC has actually put a stay, that's a pause, on these proposals in the face of litigation. That means they're being sued for doing their job, which is a bit sad. But anyway, let me tell you what I think the background to this is. So the first thing I want to say is this rule is the culmination of a process that began, the commissioner was making us all remember, hey, hang on, we've all been at this for quite a while. Everyone's going, oh my goodness, it's far too soon. Well, actually the SEC, and thank you to Ceres, you know, Reverend Spalding's here, you led this work at Ceres, got the SEC in 2010 to agree that climate risk, if it's got the word risk in it, guess what, my friends, that's what your 10K is for. You have a place to report on risk in a fairly flexible way. However, at that point, there were no standards as such. And I even remember, Ceres was formed because of the Valdez oil spill. There was an Exxon oil tanker. And the Valdez principles came out of that. When was that, Kirsten? 26 years ago. The Valdez principles that came out of that became the origin of the formation of Ceres, which is this powerhouse today. I sit on the board of Ceres, so I'm allowed to shower them with praise. They do such amazing work. So this idea that it's something new is ridiculous. Secondly, I think we've had plenty of time to get prepared. That's important. The second thing is the idea that financial markets like just to look at one thing is laughable, because your ability to allocate capital rests on the quality of the information that you've got. So I wrote down a little quote from Warren Buffett that I rather like. He says, risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. Don't you love Warren Buffett? Doesn't he just say the obvious and make it sound clever? Risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. So what will help you know what you're doing? Information. Then the question is, well, what information and why would you believe it? And is it relevant? And then you start to say, hey, everything I'm asking for from the SEC is what I expect to see on a label for a tin of Brussels sprouts. It has to be Brussels for the Commissioner, in honour to your representing that wonderful institution, the EU, the European Commission. So I want to buy some Brussels. I'm in the supermarket. Here's a tin. And they say, the price of this tin is $1. So, oh, marvellous. And the price of this tin is $7. Well, what's in this tin that's not in the... Oh, well, I'm not sure. It costs us a lot of money to start telling you things like that. The time we'd have to spend writing things onto labels, like first of all working out what did we put in the tin, we may not remember. Is it the same as we put in last time? What about salt? What about sugar? Have we got pork fat in there? I mean, you buy tins of beans in America, you find all kinds of peculiar things in there, like bits of pig. I mean, how did that happen? Anyway, leave that to one side. We expect to go and buy something, and some kind person has made sure we've got the information so we understand the price. Now, if this tin that's $1 says there are 3 Brussels sprouts in here, bloody hell, 30 cents a Brussels. Okay, let's look over here. This tin is $7. There are 25 Brussels. What a much better deal. I actually am getting some information that will help me decide whether the price is right. And that is all we're doing when we're talking about corporate information with companies. Everything we expect when we buy a tin of Brussels sprouts, heaven forbid, don't buy them in a tin. They're even worse. They're kind of a grey, sodden little bullet surrounded by slimy leaves. Anyway, yeah, you can tell I've tried it. Anyway, the point is that's not so much eat your greens as eat your greys, right? By the time they've been in a tin. But you get the point. So the question is, if we believe in free markets, we believe that the exchange in a free market is you want to buy something that I have to sell. The first thing you want to know is not the price. That's important. You want to know what you're buying. So this information that we're looking for on risk and return is simply to get corporate reporting up to the standard of a tin of Brussels sprouts. So for those complaining, you're just catching up with a tin of beans. That's the second thing. Then the third thing is we accept all night long, the board of directors was up, handwriting the labels on the tins. It was so exhausting. Now let's imagine there are some efficiencies and cost savings that can be improved. Is it going to make a difference to their business? And I want to finish by recognizing the vital work of a Nobel Prize-winning economist who was clever enough to marry Janet Yellen and who is a professor at this university. That's Azeroff, A-Z-E-R-L-O-F. He won the Nobel Prize for understanding the asymmetry of information, which means I know things that you don't know. That's all that means. Or you know things that I don't know. What he did, which was very clever, is say, I wonder what the impact of that is. And what he found in his research is that companies that do a very bad job providing information about their own very own tin of Brussels sprouts are going to have two things that we expect to see. One, most important, their cost of capital. What you're willing to spend on a tin of beans with no label, right? You've got no money, you're in the supermarket, there's all the odds and ends in a box, and there's some tins there with no label. What are you willing to pay? Not a lot, right? You assume it's not going to kill you, but you don't know what you're going to get. If there is in that box something with all the ingredients labeled and you see it signed off by the Food and Drug Administration according to standards, and then there's a discount of 10 cents, yeah, you'll buy that. So what Asilov showed is that's exactly how financial markets work. And you can go now and run the numbers around. He wasn't looking at this type of data set, so climate risk or diversity, the sustainability topics. He was looking at the usual stuff. And just in case you think ordinary financial reporting is all up to snuff, or is where it should be, if you look at the balance sheet of the S&P 500, 15% of the balance sheet is tangible assets. So what does that mean? The 85% is intangible assets. What are intangible assets? Do we have any reporting guidelines? Funnily enough, we don't. But people are not getting into a lather and breaking out in a hot sweat, fanning themselves over the fact that US GAAP cannot capture 85% of the balance sheet of the S&P 500. So this question of corporate reporting needing to evolve and keep up with what, America is now a knowledge economy. The old intangible fixed assets model isn't going to work very well. So the question is, Asilov brilliantly understood that companies that do the reporting well will be able to attract investors. That will improve the cost of capital, the quality of capital, both. And if you want to look at some recent data, testing Asilov's thesis against sustainability factors for reporting, MSCI has a very nice suite of research studies on this, and they show improved cost of capital both for equity and for debt. So that's number one. Next thing, if a company actually knows what's going on with its own workforce, human capital, or its own physical risks, like where have we put our oil refineries? Well, they're all at sea level. I mean, that's just a fact. Sewage plants. Most people in the world live near water for reasons of history, transport, and so forth. So if you don't know what your physical risks are, and you don't know what your people risks are, what conclusion might we draw about this board of directors? That they're not dialed in to what's going on. So what is interesting is in a separate set of work actually done by Wharton, who's a very good business school, is they have a data lab, and what they're showing is that companies that are doing a good job on their reporting, this is also then showing up in improved operational performance. Because the minute you say, well, everyone, we're going to produce a report, I know it myself, even at Franklin Templeton, which is an S&P 500 company, we say we will do our TCFD report, and it's like, oh, blimey, what are we doing on energy efficiency? What are we doing on recycling? What are we doing on business travel? Because you commit to it prompts a whole set of change. So let me finish with that. The SEC proposals went through extensive consultation. I'm just going to finish with what they essentially call for. The push on litigation against the SEC rules is, I would say, being funded and financed by groups who fear that it's going to be expensive to implement. As I said, if you don't know what these risks are in your business, that's an even bigger expense. If you don't actually know what your risks are, that's a problem. And investors recognize that, and you will be penalized or you'll be rewarded for doing a good job. The second thing is, investors are not only relying on the SEC getting this over the line. I think it was notable last year that at 221 major companies, investors voted against board members because of inadequate climate risk reporting. So whether or not the SEC gets these rules over the line in one shape or form, I believe they will eventually get there. They will be pushed by California, which is, on some measures, the fourth biggest economy in the world. And California is both holding on to Scope 3 emissions supply line, and also private companies will come into the mix. So California is Europe's buddy, I would say. The flyover states called New York and Washington, D.C. That's not quite fair, but you know what I mean. I think, but what will really drive this is the fact that investors long for, call for, and support regulated standards, that their fiduciary duty to exercise prudence and loyalty and care means they can't sit in a corner saying, oh, I wish a regulator had told these companies to. No, it doesn't work like that. The fiduciary duty is on you. You, as the investor, have the duty to be prudent. So even if the SEC didn't require something, you're not relieved of your fiduciary duty. So this is what the SEC wants companies, listed companies only, to provide. Disclosures about climate-related risks that are reasonably likely to have a material impact on a company's business, strategy, results of operations, or financial condition. And there's various levels of relief that have been given to that as part of the consultation process. So the thrust of the litigation is first costs, and second, scope. So saying, I saw a comment from a congressional committee chair the other day saying the SEC's job is investor protection. Yes, agreed. The SEC mission is capital formation. Well, yeah, we know that too, hurrah. And the third is the public interest. And that gets forgotten. In the 1934 Act, that was written in, the public interest. So it seems to me that it's a matter of when, not if, that the SEC manages to navigate all of these challenges, because the underlying economic logic is irresistible. So I would say we may find those companies who think they are the immovable object will meet the irresistible force of finance, and that's already having an impact. So thank you.